Daniel Boone was born on November 2, 1734, in a small settlement near Reading, Pennsylvania. His family were English Quakers, people who believed in living a simple and peaceful life. They owned a small farm, and from a young age, Daniel learned how to work the land, care for animals, and survive by using basic tools. However, Daniel was never a boy who preferred staying inside. The forests around their home became his real world of learning. By the age of 10, Boone was already skilled with a hunting rifle. His father taught him how to shoot, and Native American neighbors taught him how to move quietly through the woods, track animals, and understand outdoor survival. These lessons shaped his entire life. In the mid-1700s, the American frontier was constantly moving west. More families wanted to settle new land, but that land was already home to various Native American tribes. Because of this, the frontier was sometimes peaceful and sometimes violent. Boone grew up in this environment, one where courage, skill, and awareness were necessary to stay alive. When Daniel was a teenager, his family moved further south to the Yadkin River Valley in North Carolina. The land there was wilder, thicker with forests, and much less settled. This move gave Boone more opportunities to explore unfamiliar woods and rivers. He hunted regularly, supplying meat not only for his own family but for neighbors too. People in the settlement soon began to rely on him for guiding, tracking, and exploring. By around age 20, Boone had built a reputation. He was quiet, confident, and very capable in the wilderness. He was not talkative. Friends later described him as someone who chose words carefully and preferred action to discussion. But when he spoke about the forest, hunting trails, animal tracks, or rivers, people listened, because he understood them better than anyone. During these years, Boone began hearing stories about a legendary region to the west, a place of open meadows, rich forests, and plentiful game. The land was called Kentucky. Very few settlers had ever seen it, but stories of its beauty and abundance spread among frontiersmen. These stories planted a goal in Boone's mind that never left him. One day, he would explore Kentucky. And if the land truly existed as people said, he would lead settlers there and build a new world beyond the mountains. This dream would define the next decades of his life and shape the history of the American frontier. As Daniel Boone entered adulthood, the frontier continued to move west. The colonies along the Atlantic coast were growing, and land was becoming more crowded. Families wanted more space, more farmland, more opportunity. That meant pushing further into territory that had long been home to Native American nations. Daniel Boone was naturally suited to this life. He felt more comfortable in forests than in towns. He trusted quiet observation more than loud talk. And he believed that a man could build his own future if he had the courage to step beyond the known. Military service and early experience. In 1755, when Boone was 21, the French and Indian War broke out. It was part of a much larger global conflict between France and Great Britain. Boone served as a wagoner under British General Edward Braddock. This campaign brought him face to face with real battlefield violence for the first time. Boone saw how native warriors fought differently from European armies. They moved silently, attacked from the trees, and disappeared before the enemy could respond. He remembered every detail. These lessons would shape him as a leader later in life. During this military service, Boone also met another young frontiersman, John Finley. Finley had traveled deep into the western wilderness and had seen parts of Kentucky. Around campfires at night, he told Boone stories. Meadows filled with deer and buffalo rivers that flowed wide and clear gentle rolling forests with fertile soil land untouched by colonial settlement. Finley's stories did not sound like myths to Boone. They sounded like the place he was meant to find. In 1756, Boone married Rebecca Bryan, a strong and capable frontier woman. She understood hardship, survival, and what it took to make a home in dangerous territory. They moved back to the Yadkin Valley and began a family. Over the years, they would have 10 children. Life wasn't easy. They farmed, hunted, and defended their home when needed. Food needed to be stored through harsh winters. The threat of conflict was constant. But Rebecca remained loyal and steady, and Boone remained devoted to both his family and the wilderness. Despite being married, Boone did not settle into the life of a typical farmer. He would disappear for weeks or even months at a time, traveling deep into the forest to hunt. These long hunts were not simply for sport, they were for survival. Meat, furs, and trade goods kept the family stable. When Boone returned from these journeys, he often brought pelts, meat, and stories of what lay beyond the horizon. The wilderness continued to call him, and he answered every time. By the early 1760s, Boone could no longer ignore the pull of the unknown lands. The Appalachian Mountains stood as a massive barrier between the settled colonies and the lands beyond. Many believed the mountains could not be crossed easily. But Boone believed otherwise. In 1767, he began making deeper scouting trips westward. He explored river valleys, crossed mountain passes, followed animal trails, and learned how to move quietly through dangerous territory. These trips were full of risk. Native tribes saw their homelands being threatened, and conflict was often unavoidable. But Boone did not fear hardship. He believed that a new world existed beyond the mountains, one that could offer freedom and opportunity to any who dared to reach it. In May 1769, Boone finally set out on the expedition that would define his life. He traveled with John Finley and 4 other frontiersmen. They crossed the towering Appalachian Mountains through a difficult and narrow passage known as Cumberland Gap, a route Boone helped make known to settlers for generations. When they reached Kentucky, everything matched the stories. Endless woodland-wide rivers, abundant game like deer, elk, and buffalo, silence and beauty untouched by European settlement. Boone was deeply moved. This was not just land. This was a future. He felt that his life had been preparing him for this place. The world he had always searched for now stood before him. But Kentucky was not empty. It was home to tribes such as the Shawnee and Cherokee, who saw Boone's presence as a threat to their homeland. The stage was set for years of dangerous conflict, challenges, and survival at the edge of the world. Boone would not turn back. He had found what he was looking for, and nothing would pull him away from it now. When Daniel Boone and his small group of hunters entered Kentucky in 1769, they believed they had discovered a paradise. But Kentucky was not just wilderness, it was a borderland of competing nations, claimed by several native peoples, including the Shawnee, Cherokee, and others. For these tribes, Kentucky was not only a homeland but a sacred hunting ground. Boone respected the land and respected the people who lived there, but his presence, and the settlers who would surely follow him, represented a threat. This tension would shape the next years of his life. 4 months, Boone and his companions lived by their skill alone. Each day began before dawn. They moved quietly, tracked game, and dried meat to store for winter. Boone learned every bend of the Kentucky River, every ridge, every clearing where buffalo gathered. The forest sharpened him. He became silent, patient, and alert. Every sound, every track, every shift in wind mattered. But the wilderness did not stay quiet. In December 1769, a Shawnee war party discovered Boone's camp. They captured Boone and his men, confiscated their animal skins, and warned them, "The land belongs to us. You must leave and never return." Boone listened, respectful and calm. But inside, he had already made his decision. He would not leave. Kentucky was now part of him. Boone and his brother Squire continued their exploration deep into Kentucky. But survival became harder. They ran low on ammunition, food was scarce during winter, they were constantly hunted by tribal patrols. Boone could not return home to Rebecca to explain or reassure her. For 2 years, Boone roamed the Kentucky wilderness mostly without contact from his family. Many believed he was dead. Rebecca, after months of silence, mourned him as lost. And yet, Boone continued, driven not by glory, but by purpose. He believed Kentucky could become a new homeland for families who wanted land and freedom, away from crowded colonies and government control. Reunion and a hard decision. In 1773, Boone returned to North Carolina. Rebecca wept when she saw him, a man changed by the wilderness. He had survived on almost nothing, had seen death, starvation, and fear, yet still stood strong, calm, and certain. Boone told her his dream. "We will move west, Rebecca. We will build a new life in Kentucky, a land where our children will grow free. Rebecca trusted him. So Boone gathered several families and prepared a large migration, one of the first attempts to settle Kentucky permanently. While traveling toward Kentucky, Boone's group was ambushed by a native war party. Boone's 17-year-old son, James, and others were captured and killed. This was the deepest pain Boone had ever known. He buried his son with his own hands, in the silent darkness of the wilderness he loved. No father forgets that. No leader forgets that the cost of exploration is real. But Boone did not turn back. He returned to North Carolina only long enough to plan again. In 1775, Boone was hired by the Transylvania Company to create a trail through the Appalachian Mountains, a road settlers could follow into Kentucky. Boone accepted. He had crossed these mountains more times than anyone alive. He knew how to move through them unseen. With a small group of woodsmen, Boone carved a path through dense forest, rocky passes, river crossing steep ridges. This trail became known as. It would become the main route by which tens of thousands of settlers entered Kentucky and the West for the next century. Boone was no longer just a hunter, no longer just an explorer. He was now a Pathfinder, a man who opened the gateway to a new world. At the end of the Wilderness Road, Boone and his settlers reached the banks of the Kentucky River. There, in 1775, they built a fort, logs stacked high, cabins arranged inside, walls strong enough to withstand attack. They named it. One frontier historian later wrote, "Daniel Boone planted civilization on the edge of the unknown world." This settlement was more than buildings. It was hope, proof that frontier families could live and survive west of the mountains. But peace would not last long, because now the wilderness had changed. Now settlers were here, and the tribes who called Kentucky home would fight fiercely to defend it. The struggle for Kentucky had truly begun. By the time Boonesboro was built in 1775, the American Revolution had begun in the eastern colonies. But in Kentucky, the situation was different. Here, it was not British soldiers that Boone and his settlers faced. It was tribal alliances, particularly Shawnee warriors, led by skilled and respected leaders who believed the settlers were taking land that had always belonged to their people. Daniel Boone understood this reality. He knew Kentucky was not empty land. He respected the native people, their knowledge, their traditions, and their connection to the land. But he also believed that families fleeing overcrowded colonies deserved a new start. This belief placed him directly between two worlds, and both would test him. Life in the fort was harsh. Every day required work. Cutting timber, carrying water from the river, planting corn in small clearings, hunting carefully and returning quietly. The settlers could not wander far. Shawnee scouting parties watched from the tree lines. Every movement had to be cautious. Every sound could be danger. Despite constant threat, Boone stayed calm. He encouraged discipline, watchfulness, and quiet confidence. Rebecca cooked for families, comforted women, and tried to create normal life for children inside the fort walls. Yet everyone knew survival depended on Boone. In February 1778, the fort needed salt, a vital resource to preserve meat. Without it, they would not survive winter. Boone led a team of about 30 men to the lower Blue Licks, a well-known salt-making site. There, while gathering salt, Boone's group was surrounded and captured by a large Shawnee force led by Chief Blackfish, a respected and intelligent leader. Boone did not resist. He understood that a fight would kill his men. So he made a decision that showed both courage and strategy. He offered himself and his group as captives on the condition that Boonesboro would not be attacked while he was gone. Blackfish respected Boone. He recognized him as a man of skill and honor. So rather than killing him, he brought Boone and his men to the Shawnee town of Chillicothe. Boone lived among the Shawnee for several months. He observed their customs, their families, and their way of life. They treated him not as a prisoner, but as someone they hoped to adopt into their society. Blackfish, trusting Boone's strength and leadership, made him a member of the tribe through a traditional adoption ceremony. Boone was given new clothing, new responsibilities, and was watched, yet not confined. Boone adapted. He did what survivors do. He learned. He listened. He waited. But Boone never forgot his duty to his people in Boonesboro. In June 1778, Boone learned that the Shawnee were preparing a major assault on Boonesboro, hundreds of warriors. If the attack succeeded, the settlement would be destroyed and everyone inside would be killed or taken captive. Boone made his choice. One morning, while on a hunting assignment, Boone ran. He covered 160 miles in 4 days, through forest, water, and rugged terrain, without stopping to sleep for long. When he returned to the fort, his clothes were torn, his body exhausted, but his message was clear. Prepare. They are coming. In September 1778, hundreds of Shawnee warriors surrounded the fort. The siege lasted 11 days. Arrows flew over the walls. Rifles cracked from the tree line. The settlers fired from firing slits Boone had designed. Women molded bullets while children carried water and powder. Boone moved constantly, calming the frightened, giving orders, reinforcing weak points, encouraging his riflemen to aim patiently and shoot carefully. His experience, discipline, and composure held the settlement together. One frontier witness later wrote, "Where others saw fear, Boone saw what must be done." The siege eventually failed because the settlers refused to break. The Shawnee withdrew. But victory did not bring peace. Some settlers accused Boone of treason for allowing himself to be adopted by the Shawnee and for not escaping sooner. Rumors spread. Suspicion clouded his name. So Boone stood before a military court. He spoke plainly. He surrendered to save his men. He lived among the Shawnee to learn their plans. He escaped to warn the fort. And he remained loyal every moment. The court cleared him completely, and the settlers who doubted him now praised him stronger than ever. But Boone did not celebrate. The wilderness had changed him. Loss, captivity, conflict, and leadership had weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a leader carrying the burden of lives. After the siege of Boonesboro, Daniel Boone's name spread across the frontier. He was known now not just as a hunter or explorer, but as a defender of families, a man who would not break under pressure, and someone who knew the wilderness better than anyone alive. But being a hero did not mean peace. The frontier was still dangerous, and Kentucky was still contested territory. While the American Revolution raged in the East between colonial militias and British forces, the frontier war took a different shape. It was a war of small ambushes, raiding parties, skirmishes in forests, night attacks on lonely cabins, quick escapes, and sudden losses. Boone and the settlers of Kentucky were not only trying to survive, they were trying to establish a permanent home. Boone served as scout commander of militia companies, protector of settlements, messenger between frontier and government. He did not lead from behind. He tracked, patrolled, and fought beside his men, rifle in hand, boots in the mud, eyes always watching the tree line. In 1780, Boone faced one of the greatest tragedies of his life. During a raid and counter-raid conflict known as the Battle of Blue Licks, Boone's son Israel, only 23 years old, was killed. Boone was there. He saw his son fall. He ran to him. He lifted him. There was nothing he could do. People remembered that moment. Boone did not shout. Boone did not cry where others could see. He simply closed his son's eyes and carried him away from the field. This was the second son Boone had lost on the frontier. Pain did not break him, but it worked itself into his quietness, his patience, his silence. From that day forward, Boone spoke even less than before. Even as grief weighed on him, settlers still depended on Boone. He guided new families into Kentucky by the Wilderness Road. He negotiated with tribal leaders when possible. He patrolled the woods when danger rose. Boone never asked for reward. He did what he believed needed to be done. But legal troubles followed. Boone was not a man who cared about paperwork, legal claims, or government officials. But the world was changing. Land now had titles, laws, boundaries, and taxes. Boone had helped settle and defend Kentucky, But the land he claimed for himself was taken out from under him because of complicated title disputes. He lost thousands of acres, land he had risked his life to secure. This did not make him angry, and it did not make him bitter. It simply pushed him further west, once again, just as he had done his entire life. By the mid-1790s, Kentucky was no longer wilderness. Towns had formed. Courts were operating. Fences and property lines were being drawn. This was not Boone's world anymore. He gathered his family once more and moved further west, past the Mississippi River, to what was then Spanish-controlled Missouri, where land was still open, wild, and quiet. There he lived simply. Hunting, trapping, exploring forests, telling stories beside fires, teaching younger frontiersmen tracking and survival. Boone was older now, but still strong. His eyes still watched the woods like a man who belonged to them. His step was still sure and silent. Visitors traveled long distances to meet him. They wanted to shake his hand, to hear him describe the first buffalo hunting grounds of Kentucky, crossing the mountains, the siege of Boonesboro, his escapes and trails and long hunts. Some came expecting a hero of loud boasting and big speeches. Instead, they found a quiet man. A man who spoke slowly, simply, and honestly. They often said the same thing afterward. Boone did not try to seem great, and that made him greater. Daniel Boone's life was not about conquering, not about fame, not about glory. It was about freedom. The freedom to walk into the unknown. The freedom to carve a home in a place untouched. The freedom to live by skill, courage, and patience, not by rules of others. He opened the way west. He changed the shape of America. And he did it without asking for anything in return. By the end of this period, Boone had lived 2 full lives. One as a hunter and explorer, one as a leader and protector. But his journey was not finished yet. Same tone, long, deep, clear, powerful, cinematic. This is Boone's final chapter. When Daniel Boone moved with his family into the Missouri Territory in 1799, he was already a legend on the frontier. But he did not move to Missouri to retire or to be admired. He moved because he wanted space, silence, and the freedom of the untouched wilderness, the same thing he had searched for his entire life. Missouri in 1799 was what Kentucky had been 30 years earlier. Thick forests without roads, rivers that ran wide, and wild wildlife moving freely across valleys, a land where you could walk for days without seeing another settler. This was the world Boone understood. This was where he lived with ease. Boone settled near the Femme Osage Creek with his family. The Spanish authorities welcomed him gladly, so much that they granted him thousands of acres of land and appointed him as a judge and community leader. It was a strange role for a man like Boone. He had never cared much for government, courts, or official titles. But this role was different. There were no wigs or lawyers. Cases were settled beneath trees. Judgment was based on fairness and character. Boone listened carefully, spoke simply, and made decisions that aligned with the plain truth of a situation. People trusted him. People believed him. Not because of his words, but because of the life he had lived. Even in his 60s and 70s, Boone did not stay close to the cabin. He would disappear alone for days or weeks, rifle on shoulder, moving silently across the land like a young hunter. Neighbors would say, "We saw his footprints." That is how we knew he was still alive. Boone hunted not for sport, but because the wilderness was his home, his peace, his identity. He walked with age, but not weakness. The woods had kept him lean, strong, and calm. When the United States eventually took control of Missouri, Boone again faced legal disputes regarding land ownership, the same problem that drove him from Kentucky. Boone lost almost all of the land he had been granted. This time, too, he did not rage. He did not argue. He did not demand. He simply accepted reality. Boone once said quietly to a neighbor, "I have never been lost, but I will admit to being confused for a few days." His humor was simple, but honest. In 1810, when he was about 75 years old, Boone undertook one final, long hunting expedition. He traveled hundreds of miles on foot and horseback. He trapped, hunted, skinned, and carried loads of fur. He slept under the stars. He drank from rivers. He tracked animals by broken twigs and faint trails in leaves. This was not adventure. This was returning to who he had always been. It was a final conversation between Boone and the wilderness, a goodbye spoken without words. As his strength eventually faded, Boone spent his days carving wooden bowls and spoons, sitting quietly beside fires, telling stories to children who listened with wide eyes, watching sunlight move across the trees. He never pretended to be heroic. He never called himself a conqueror. He simply smiled, as though he had seen more than anyone could ever understand. When asked late in his life if he ever regretted leaving civilization behind, Boone answered, "I was happier with my gun and my dog than with all the king's gold." Daniel Boone died on September 26, 1820, at the age of 85, in his home in Missouri. He passed away calmly, seated near a fireplace, surrounded by family. There was no dramatic final statement, no speech for history books. He simply rested, the same way a man rests after a long journey. Daniel Boone did not invent the American frontier, but he defined it. He did not take land by force, he opened it through endurance, understanding of the land, courage under hardship, leadership built from quiet confidence. His life became a symbol of American expansion, not because he sought fame, but because he lived true to purpose. Boone's legacy is not in monuments, statues, or books. It is in every road that crosses mountains. It is in every family that moved west searching for a new life. It is in every person who refuses to live small when the world is wide. Daniel Boone's life says one thing: the world belongs to those who are willing to walk into the unknown.